we're going to be having a look at homeostasis and hormonal action, right? In syllabus. So we're going to be looking at things like receptors, effectors, what is a feedback loop, what is a negative feedback loop versus a positive feedback loop. Looking at homeostatic equilibrium, right? Looking at our ductless glands and how ductless glands operate. Then looking at our insulin and our glucagon, how it is produced by our um, pancreatic cells in our nodes of Langerhans, right? Langerhans rather. And then looking at how all of that happens, and then ending with discussing the commercial use of ethylene, which is a plant hormone. All right. So homeostasis. So from CSET biology, I remember this definition. It is a process by which living organisms maintain a stable internal environment despite changes in external conditions. Full stop. That is the same definition I've been using for 6 years now. Right? So, same definition. So it's basically speaking about the the, the importance, right, of making sure that within an organism, certain parameters are set to certain set points. Set points is a term that we must define. Set to certain set points, right, to make sure that there's some amount of homogeneity within the organism. All right. Looking at homeostatic terminology, receptors, we know that are sensors that detect changes in internal or external environment, right? So we know temperature, pH, blood glucose levels, blood water levels, those type of things, right? Set points, these are desirable or target values for various physiological conditions such as body temperature, which is around 37. So set point tend to be a range, right? There are always ranges. So it's around 37 degrees Celsius. It's not 37 degrees Celsius. There's a reason why the word around is there. There's a range. There are always ranges. Effectors now, these are organs, tissues, or cells that act to restore the variable to its set point, right? And our feedback loops now, these are the mechanisms that we use to regulate internal environment. Okay? So let's look at this. Let's have a proper look at this now. Feedback mechanisms. What are feedback mechanisms? Anybody, from their own standpoint, what are feedback mechanisms? Go ahead.
So I think something goes actually as a response to like changes or to any stimuli in the body.
Okay. So it speaks to relationships between effectors and receptors, right? And what's happening there. So how they influence each other, the entire mechanism thing. So negative feedback loops, right? They really act to reduce the output or activity of some type of internal variable. They reduce it. That's why they're negative feedback loops, right? So the most common ones are generally like body temperature regulation, right? So the receptor would be thermoreceptors in the skin, and the hypothalamus detects the changes in body temperature. The set point is about 37 degrees Celsius. So our effectors in this case have been sweat glands, right, and different muscles, right, our erector muscles. This is CSET biology, by the way. Erector muscles, right, that increases, the torsion upon the hair cells, right? Right, so that can allow them to the follicle cells for them to like stand up or lay down, depending on whether it's too hot or too cold. And then we have a feedback loop there. So if the body temperature rises above the set point, the sweat glands act to cool the body. If the body temperature falls below a set point, the muscles and shivering generates heat. So that makes sense, right? It's a negative feedback loop. It works against the variable. Okay? So that's an example there. This is so much CSEC. Alright. So it works against, right? Then positive feedback loops now. So it amplifies an initial stimulus. So instead of working against like negative feedback loops, it works towards increasing the thing. Right? So like blood clotting, platelets detect a break in the blood vessel, and the set point is not applicable to this process though. No, but the effectors are the platelets chemical release chemicals, or the platelets release chemicals that attract more platelets. So that's really the effectors. The effectors are the platelets that call more platelets, and then the feedback loop would be the initial platelet activation attracts more platelets to the side and rapidly forming a clot. So the entire feedback loop is that the platelet itself will cause more platelets to come. That will cause more platelets to come. That will cause more and more and more and more and more. So positive feedback loops amplifies variables rather than dissipates them. So in negative feedback loops, we reduce a variable. In positive feedback loops, we amplify a variable. That's the difference, right? So this is the platelet thing. Alright? So those are general differences. So dynamics of feedback mechanisms, we're asked to look at this as well, right? So let me see where that is. In 4.1, objective 4.1, we're asked to look at the homeostatic equilibrium, right, and emphasize on the dynamics of feedback mechanisms. So homeostasis involves continuous monitoring and adjustment, right? That's what we're saying. So we need to know exactly where our body is at, and we need to know where it should be in order to get it back to that place, right? So we balance it via different oscillations. So parameters oscillate around a set point. So it's not our body temperature is never 37 alone. Our entire body is never one temperature. Our entire blood, the entirety of the concentration of the blood is never just one glucose concentration, right? Our body is always oscillating between these two parameters. We know what oscillation is, right? So always moving back and forth between the set points, right? So that's why it's a
Sure.
range. Go ahead.
Did you go through the principles of hormonal action?
No, we're gonna go to the principles.
Okay.
We reach the principles yet, right? So looking at that, right? So we're always having some amount of oscillation, right? And these are in response to any external stimuli, right? Integration, now we know that multiple feedback loops often operate simultaneously, right? To maintain overall homeostasis. For instance, maintaining blood pressure involves the cardiovascular system, the renal system, and the nervous system. So they usually work together in order to gain this homeostatic equilibrium. Alright? Homeostatic equilibrium. So it speaks to that dynamic state of stability within an organism. The internal environment of the organism needs to be stable, right? So it's really balancing all these multiple variables and having all the bodily systems work together in order to keep these set physiological parameters, right? That is what we're talking about. Now, the principles of hormonal action, we have to look at the mechanisms, right? So we're looking at the secretion by endocrine glands. We're looking at endocrine glands, or what we call ductless glands in animals. These are some of the general things that we must speak about. So endocrine glands, right? We know that these are ductless glands that release hormones directly into the bloodstream. And we know what secretion is. Secretion, hormones are secreted in response to different stimuli such as neural signals or other hormones or changes in the internal environment, right? So we have that there. So we have the secretion by endocrine glands, right? Transport through the bloodstream, we know that hormones travel through the bloodstream, so it actually takes longer than nervous responses, but they tend to be way more stronger than nervous responses, right? We're going to be looking at that. Right, so hormones travel through the bloodstream to reach the target cells, right, located throughout the body. So these are the simple principles, the principle of the endocrine gland, specifically how they work. This is what we're talking about, right? Target cells and receptors. We know that we have hormone specificity. Hormones affect only target cells, right? So the cells that have the receptors for the hormone, those are the only cells that the hormones will affect, right? And the receptors specifically are the proteins located in the cell membrane, right? So it binds to the hormone and it mediates its effects. So an example here, we have different cells for different hormones, and we have different hormones here, right? So it's specific. We have cell transduction. What that mean? When the hormones bind to the receptors, there's some conformational change that's occurring, right? So the intracellular pathways, now this binding initiates a series of intracellular events, which is cell signal transduction, right? And leads to physiological response, right? So for example, here we have the receptors for tyrosine kinase, right? Receptor tyrosine kinase here, and we have these tyrosine residues, right? When the hormones reach these receptors, right, it causes, right, the release right, of these different tyrosine residues, right? So it causes some amount of conformational change, allowing for something to actually occur. So these are the effectors, all right? So we're looking at that. So it binds to a receptor and then some amount of effect occurs, right? Physiological response without regulation, the hormone receptor interaction often results in some amount of regulation, right? So it via cell activities, right? Usually gene expression, enzyme activity, anytime like that. Channel permeability, we'll look at that, right? So channel permeability, we'll look at that for the kidneys specifically. All right. And we know feedback mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms are part of one of the fundamental principles of how hormones work, right? We're gonna be looking at that. We'll look at them already though. Alright? So let's have a look at this now. The ductless glands, right? Let's look at some ductless glands as some examples. So an example is a pituitary gland that secretes growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, right? And all these different things. And I'll list some things of what they do as well, right? Just going through some of them. So if you want to pause or screenshot or whatever, that's fine, right? I'm just going through some of the most natural ones that we talk about, especially in CSEC. Thyroid gland, right? Thyroxine and tridothyronine, right? So T4 and T3, right, are things that are emitted by the thyroid cells, right? And they help with the metabolic rate, right? So when you have hypo and hyperthyroidism, you know that happen. You know what happens with your growth and development. It actually is hindered in some way or is affected in some way because the thyroid deals with metabolic rate mostly, right, and body temperature. Adrenal glands located right above the kidneys there help with the secretion of cortisol and adrenaline, right, or what we call epinephrine, right? Epinephrine is adrenaline, right? And we have aldosterone, aldosterone. Sorry about that. Aldosterone, right? So we have that there. So we know what cortisol does, adrenaline does, aldosterone does, right? So I have all the information there, right? Just giving examples of these glands, right? Where they are, what they do. Okay. The pancreas as well is one of the major organs as well, and it helps with the production of glucagon and insulin, right, for the regulation of blood glucose levels. The ovaries are here for the production of estrogen and progesterone as well. And we know what estrogen and progesterone does. That's a module 1 thing. All right. The testes, right, help produce testosterone, right? So we speak about that, and some amount of inhibin as well. Okay, so I have that as well. But specifically, we're called to look at the pancreas, right? And we're gonna be looking at that a little bit more in depth, right, than everything else.